We are live. Hi, everyone. My name is Sonia, and I am from WorkSafe Tasmania. I will be your moderator today. This session is Understanding Trauma and its Impact on Workplace Leadership and Culture, presented by Bianca Welsh from Stillwater Restaurant and 7 Rooms from Experience. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the original and continuing custodians of the land, sea, and sky. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, all of whom have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture, and Aboriginal rights. Now, please take a moment to read the following slide about information you'll receive today. Use the chat tab to type any questions you may have towards the right-hand side. Those questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. Only presenter webcams will be used. And today's presentation is also being recorded and will be available on WorkSafe Tasmania's YouTube channel towards the end of the month. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce your presenter, Bianca Welsh from Stillwater Restaurant and 7 Rooms from Experience. Bianca is a seasoned restaurateur with 20 years experience running multiple businesses while completing a Bachelor of Behavioural Science. She applies her knowledge to create mentally healthy workplaces, achieving low staff turnover, and is passionate about helping leaders understand trauma, grief, mental illness, and neurodiversity to foster supportive, thriving teams. Welcome to the webinar, Bianca. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, and thank you for taking an hour out of your busy days to join me on this topic that I'm very passionate about and could honestly spend all day, multiple days talking about this. So I've tried to condense what I would probably normally do over a couple of hours into an hour, and just giving you a little snapshot about what does trauma look like, what does it look like in the workplace, and a couple of those psychological theories that sit behind that. So I'd also like to acknowledge any lived experience we have in our virtual room of mental illness and poor mental health, and also those who love and care for others on their journey. Some of the content we have today might be activating. I much prefer the word activating than triggered. Triggered to me implies that it needs to go off and needs to explode. Activating means we can feel the feels, we can have some bodily sensations and emotions, but it doesn't mean they need to go off or explode. However, if you are having an activating moment and you just need to take a break, of course, feel free to do so, but please take some self-care around you and after this, should anything stir up some emotions. And of course, I'm always here to reach out afterwards. At the end, you'll get my contact details if you'd like to get in touch with me direct. So Sonia very kindly gave a bit of my bio. In addition to that, I sit on a couple of boards, so TASTAFE and the Launceston Chamber of Commerce. I'm a mental health first aid instructor, and yes, very, very proudly graduated with a Bachelor of Behavioural Science in 2018, alongside running multiple businesses, and that was within that time having our first child. I think I love the 3 H's. I think it gives a really nice snapshot of who someone is: my highlight, my hardship, my hero. My highlight, of course, are my children. Our eldest just turned 9 and our little girl just turned 2. My hardship is we lost our middle child to a termination for medical reasons. He was full term at 37 weeks. My son is holding a picture of him in the left-hand picture. I contracted a parasite that I was unbeknownst, and it caused significant brain damage. That was in 2022. And my journey of grief and loss will continue for the rest of my life. But being diagnosed with PTSD afterwards was certainly, it's been a journey. And to be here today, I'm very proud to be here today to talk to you about all these topics, because I didn't think I'd ever be able to go back to doing this again. And my hero, it sounds really corny, but it is my husband. He has a really long journey of mental illness and poor mental health. And with his permission, I share a lot of his story, which is actually now my story, particularly as being a carer. I think that carer voice has not quite reached the awareness that probably it should, because it certainly takes its toll. So with his permission, I share some of his stuff because it helps contextualize all these things that I've come to learn and have experienced both personally and then in the workplace. Okay, so we're going to crack into a lot of different topics, and I hope it's not too much, but we're going to cover what makes us us, a bit about the biopsychosocial model. We're going to talk about trauma, adverse childhood events, and then we'll finish on talking about what does trauma-informed actually look like, because it's become a bit of a buzzword and it's become something that has a bit of a box tick, I think, in a lot of corporate areas. So we certainly don't want it to be just a box tick. So what makes us us? I promised myself when I started my degree that if I wasn't enjoying what I was learning, I would stop, because I had plenty of stuff going on. But what I did learn each and every semester, each and every day, I just really drank in and really found it so fascinating. But how layered everything is, how we are not just one psychological theory, we are many different things that come and interplay together. So if you're not a fan of a burger, you can be a pizza. But what we need to understand as leaders is that we need to be self-aware of what makes us us. What is our biopsychosocial model, which I'll talk about in a moment. Maybe you've done the Myers-Briggs, which is now what's called 16 personalities or whatever it's called now. And you understand that maybe you've got a particular type of temperament. Your personality informs who you are. Your star sign, like there's just so many. We all have a different feeling, and that will impact on the way that we lead, we interact, the way we think about ourselves, the way we express emotions, our coping strategies, all that sort of stuff. We all are very different. And I think sometimes in the business world, we can tend to expect a very similar type. We have this ideal of a certain type of maybe employee or a certain type of leader, but what we need to understand is there's good and bad of sort of every different type, but understanding what makes us us is a really important step towards being able to lead with those characteristics that we're ideally wanting now in our modern world. So a little bit about the biopsychosocial model. Many of you have probably heard about this. It is what all mental illnesses are now based upon, is understanding the very complex interplay of the bio, psycho, and social elements of what makes us us. Now, what was once thought to just be a chemical imbalance in the brain in terms of what caused a mental illness, we now understand it's all three of these things. Now, I go into this very in depth. Anyone that's done my mental health first aid courses will know that I kind of digress and I go off on my own tangent just for a moment, because I think this is a really important part to learn for leaders. And again, for that self-awareness. So I'll just spend a moment to talk about a couple of different areas. So when we look at the biological, if we were doing this in a workshop, I'd be able to get you to brainstorm each of these areas yourself. So we don't have the time or the capability to do that today. But in the biological, you've got things like your physical health, your genetic vulnerability, and your neurochemistry. That is all essentially gifted to you from generational, from grandparents, your parents. There's a lot of things that influence that you don't necessarily choose. In the social, things like peer group, where you went to school, we don't have the ability when we're 5 to say, hey, I want to go to this school. Your parents will send you to an area and a school that they can afford and that is suitable for lifestyle, etc. Socioeconomic status, you often don't have ability to control that until you are of working age. And even then, when we talk about intergenerational trauma and intergenerational poverty and all those sorts of things, status, expectation, there's so much there that is deeply ingrained that can be really hard to break. In the psychological, temperament, perception, social skills, coping skills, they're all developed at a very young age. Temperament, that is one in the psychology world that is largely agreed upon that we are born with. It is mostly agreed that we will develop a personality based on all sorts of life experiences and reasons, but temperament is generally agreed that we are born with that. Anyone that's been around a newborn or had their own knows that they either come out kicking and screaming and go, no, I'm not very happy with this outside world, or they come out pretty content, and that can then inform the development of things like coping skills and personality. So what I think is really important to understand is, like the burger, we all have a very different biopsychosocial makeup, and a lot of that has been not by choice. However, a lot of it can be worked on and potentially made more protective or adaptive, as opposed to being a risk factor to developing a mental illness, if all of these were in kind of the maladaptive or perhaps negative light, if you looked at all of these. Now, I could spend all day talking about an example of every single one of these just on this simple Venn diagram that I got off the internet, of how it has interacted with the workplace. So for an example, immune stress response there in the biological, that refers to our flight, fight, freeze response. Now that is from a part of our brain that's the oldest part of our brain. It's just located just above our brainstem, is where that part will activate when we go into flight, fight, freeze mode. As we move further and more forward in our brain, that is our youngest parts of our brain, which are more to do with our executive functioning. So you think of the prefrontal cortex as being the CEO or the boss of your brain. That makes all of those executive functioning decisions. What you chose to wear today, who you're friends with, what you ate, the fact that you decided to sign up and come to this is all in your executive functioning. And the further back we go, they are the older parts and what's called the reptilian part of our brain. In a stressful situation, the prefrontal cortex, and I'll talk about this more and when we talk about trauma in a couple of sections, is that the prefrontal cortex will tend to go offline. And what happens is the brainstem, just that bit above the reptilian part of the brain, is the part that will activate. Now, because it is the oldest part of our brain, and in terms of our prefrontal cortex development, it's not that old. So what that part will think is, when we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, we're being, it's more of that animalistic response. Now, as I mentioned, because in a stressful or traumatic situation, the prefrontal cortex goes online, our body and brain don't know or how to filter or how to comprehend what might be going on. So for someone to respond in a surprising way, in a plethora of examples, can often not be by control or by choice. Another one there, response to reward in between biological and psychological. So this will relate to when we're about to talk about attachment theory in a moment as well. So my husband and I, we're both front of house. So I run the front of house. James is the sommelier. So we're often referred to as the mum and dad of the business. And we can often, back before we had children, we always joke that to stay married, one would be in one restaurant and one would be in the other. So I'd be maybe at Black Cow and he would be at Stillwater, because the two of us in the one domain was sometimes a bit chaotic. So at the end of service, we'd of course go home and talk about how was service, who did what, staff development, etc., performance. And it would be really interesting over time, because we were working so closely with our team, we would identify perhaps a performance issue that was related to their attachment to either mum or dad. So knowing a little bit about perhaps their family background, that maybe there was a fraught relationship with their mum, and that any constructive or even positive feedback from me would be received really negatively and in quite a distressing way. Whereas maybe they had an attachment to a father figure that meant that they wanted that kudos, they wanted that recognition. And that would inform now, and I'll reiterate this again when we talk about attachment theory, is that that's not for you to fix. That's not for you to psychoanalyze. That's not for you to need to change, but to understand that a response like that can really inform performance and interactions and relationships in the workplace. Just allows us to maybe take a step back and assess, am I the right person to provide constructive feedback? Is it better off that they receive it from a different supervisor, someone else? Is there a way that I can create a more trusting and safer relationship with them so that I can get the best out of them? Oh, I could really talk about all day about a different example of this, but I hope that's just tried to perhaps spark a little bit of curiosity in you that the way someone responds is for a huge range of reasons that that person is probably not even conscious that they're aware of, or understand that it would interact with the workplace. So we're going to talk a bit now about trauma, and I love this this quote from Gabor Mate. If you are not already aware of him, I highly recommend all the plethora of books that he's written. He's written a lot. He appears on a lot of podcasts at the moment. He's like 81, but he's just got a really, really amazing message about trauma. But so the important distinction to make is that trauma is not what happened to you. It's what happened inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So often in the general public will often think that trauma is only about people that have experienced it, only the ones that have maybe been to war, or they've experienced an extreme weather event, a car accident. And what we need to understand is so much more than that. It is the invisible epidemic, and that so many more people have experienced trauma that you would not be aware of, and perhaps that they're not even aware of. They haven't allowed themselves to think that what they have experienced is trauma. So when we're talking about the spectrum of trauma, we're thinking about it from the 3 E's: the event, the experience, and the effect. So the experience and the effect will vary, of course, from person to person, depending on a range of factors: life experience, stress response, genetic vulnerability, even the developmental stage that it occurred. There was a really interesting study just come out, I think it was 2020, from some amazing research and trauma experts in America, that showed if a child, it was a longitudinal study, if a child experienced a traumatic event, and I believe that this was about childhood abuse, was if they experienced it at a certain age, they could now map that a certain part of their brain would be impacted. So for example, I think it was at 3 years old, the amygdala would be affected, which is about your memory center. Then come your maybe 7 or 8. I think it was the hippocampus. Sorry, that's the memory center. Amygdala is your fear area. And so it's a really interesting to show that there's a genetic change. There can be a DNA change from experience of trauma. And so, if we go back to this page, there's a whole range of reasons as to why someone will experience and the effect that an event has on them will then manifest. And so another person, I really encourage you to read their book, do a bit of research. I think it's really important, as any leader, is Bessel van der Kolk, and he's written the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And he states, we have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. The memory of the trauma is as traumatizing as the trauma. So when we're talking about what types of trauma there are, you've got, of course, acute, from a single incident, and probably something that's a bit more obvious that's occurred. It was public. People know that maybe this accident or this incident occurred. Then you've got chronic and complex, which tend to be repeated, prolonged, behind closed doors, and complex is exposure to a range of different traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. There's another way of looking at it, which are the big T traumas and the little t traumas. And the big T ones are the ones that we see, the ones that we might, that seem monumental, I guess. And then the little t ones, which can often be dismissed by people that might not understand those 3 E's of trauma. So emotional neglect, people pleasing, bullying, infidelity, parental pressure, unhealthy relationships. And we could spend all day of giving reasons why those things that someone else might be able to cope with and not be as big of a trauma, there'd be a plethora of reasons, especially around that biopsychosocial model, as to why that has had such an impact on a person. As I mentioned before, I think it's really important to understand the prevalence of trauma. So it's estimated that 75% of Australians have experienced a traumatic event in their life. Not all need to go on and receive professional help. And it's hard to really gauge, but some estimates and some studies will suggest that about 1/3 of people do need to seek professional help. However, the thing with trauma is that the impact of it cannot be understood for months, sometimes decades for some people. Sometimes things might not pop up until they're in their 70s or 80s and from something of their childhood. And as I mentioned, the book that I recommend you all to read is that The Body Does Keep the Score. So trauma can diminish healthy development, memory, perception, and judgment. It can lead to changes in the brain that impact the body and mind throughout the lifespan and influence behaviour and relationships. Neuroscience shows the brain will activate the areas involved in fear and perception. As I mentioned before, a key element to understand is the brain will struggle to filter what is relevant or irrelevant information, particularly around bodily sensations. So what will often happen is the person will almost feel that they're stuck in that traumatic experience, that their brain is stuck in that. The time, I'll talk about that in a minute, the time receptor kind of goes offline, and that it'll feel like they are under threat constantly. And I can certainly say now with my experience, it's almost a bit, I don't know, masochistic perhaps, or that I was able to have this experience myself of trauma and then almost push the fourth wall and like reflect on what was happening in my brain and body at the time of when I was particularly, my PTSD symptoms were very heightened. Things like losing the ability to make decisions, memory. I couldn't remember people's names of people that I know very well. My perception of things, my judgment of things, like it really is to experience for the first time as an adult, to experience trauma and then to experience those PTSD symptoms. It can also be it can almost be surprising as to the impact that it does have on the brain and the body. So what happens when what happens in the brain? And I think this neuroscience part, one, it can be very overwhelming to try to comprehend, but I think it's a really important part to just kind of allow ourselves and others, and understanding why others have experienced what they've experienced and the effect that it's having on them, by understanding a little bit about the mechanics of what's going on in our brain. And I'm sorry my presentation didn't quite export properly because those bold bits were meant to come up after I talked about what I was going to talk about. So pretend the left hemisphere doesn't have that goes offline bit. So what does the left hemisphere do? It organizes memory, and there's the problem solving part, creates symbols, so it transcribes personal experience into culturally shared meaning. Creativity, the distinguishing feature of the left hemisphere is cognition, and lack of hemisphere functioning in PTSD responsible. That is the part that's responsible for what's called alexithymia. You might have heard it, and it's essentially not knowing what you feel or even being able to describe how you feel. It's that numb, don't know, but something's not right. Then in the right hemisphere, you've got all your creativity, artistic spontaneity, emotional processing. And what happens is that the left part goes offline. So remember, this is the part that has the sense of time and logic, and that goes offline. So often when people feel like that the event lasted for forever and it was actually only a couple of minutes, it can be a reason why they feel that way. And then all logic goes out the window. If we're looking at just a different angle of the brain and then what is happening in the prefrontal cortex, you've got that sense of time again, context, and that's where you are able to inhibit inappropriate emotion, or what we've learned to be inappropriate emotion. The hippocampus is responsible for learning and trauma, and the amygdala controls emotion, especially fear and anxiety. So then also what's been shown in trauma, in a traumatic event, is that the prefrontal cortex will shut down. And that is also the part where our language center is. You might have heard of people that have Broca's aphasia. That's where they're not able to, they've got difficulty with language. Perhaps they might have an example of where they can't describe, like, what I'm talking on is a computer, but they might call it a salad, and they've got no awareness that what the word is incorrect. It's a complete jumble, or perhaps where they've lost the ability to speak. And it's often in traumatic brain injuries. If the Broca's aphasia is impacted, that's often when they're not able to use their voice. So when people often describe by saying they have no words for what they experienced, that can often be a physical reason why, because that did go offline. And as I discussed before, in the hippocampus, you've got things, with the memory and learning part, it can tend to change as a result of trauma. Then with the amygdala, it lights up. That is the part that's firing, the fear, the anxiety, and the emotion. So when you're watching maybe a movie and someone's expressing themselves in a really over-the-top way, or you've witnessed this in real life, there can be reasons why, because all the logic has gone offline and the emotional part is firing up. Another great Bessel quote, just very quickly, and then we'll move on from the trauma section, is one of the most devastating effects of trauma is that people's biology changes into a biology of threat, such as stress hormones and immunology and what the brain selects to pay attention to. The intrinsic reward system changes, as do attractors, what turns you on or leaves you cold. As a consequence, traumatized people stay on hyper alert. They feel chronically unsafe and in danger, and they have problems feeling calm and enjoying the moment. And they are out of touch with their surroundings. Trauma can make it difficult to have comfortable reciprocal relationships with one's children, partners, and co-workers. So again, just to round out this trauma section, is that it is an invisible epidemic. There are probably a plethora of people that perhaps have some trauma symptoms and they don't realize, and how much it is impacting on their day-to-day interactions, the ability to make decisions, emotions, and then possibly, remember I don't like the word triggered, but possibly something, a smell, a sound, the physical presence of someone might remind them and perhaps has triggered that trauma subconsciously or consciously. And unfortunately, in our world of work particularly, and when I go around and do these things in hospitality, is that we don't often have control of who walks in the door. We are dealing with the general public, and we never know what's going to come to us, perhaps as opposed to, like maybe an office environment where it's by appointment only. You've kind of got a little bit of an idea of maybe what's going to come in that door. So when we have these people-facing roles, for me, and what I've experienced in our workplace, is that trauma is probably the thing that has impacted the most. And we have supported people through things like depression and anxiety is obviously the most common, but people that have experienced bipolar, psychosis, trauma, grief, rape, sexual assault, drug addiction, substance abuse, terminal illness, like you name it, we have tried to support people through working together in trying to keep them feel safe and able to come to work to some capacity that they're able to do. Obviously, that can't be forever if they're not able to give me 100% and it's only 50% we'll work together into how we can work on getting them back to that 100%. And industry average for turnover in hospitality is 80%, and we very proudly sit at 10%. And the reason we put that down to is being a mentally healthy workplace, but particularly having a trauma lens and understanding that people will respond in ways that they can't control. So some of you may have heard about the ACE score. So adverse childhood experiences are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood, so 0 to 17 years. This came out of a lot of research in America, so it does not always translate culturally. This was done on mostly white middle-class Americans, but what has come out of it has shown time and time again a lot of predictability of some things that we'll talk about in a moment. The research, there's a plethora of research about adverse childhood experiences. So it's a questionnaire essentially that you can Google it and do it yourself if you feel you need to do so. And you basically get a point for each question you do answer yes. And some of those questions might be around experiencing violence, abuse or neglect, witnessing violence in the home or community, or having a family member attempt or die by suicide, as just an example. And one of those example questions specifically is, did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other. So I think it's really interesting how this research, how the adverse childhood experience score came about. Is a practicing psychiatrist who worked with obese patients began to realise that each of his patients had been sexually abused. And when he started to actually look historically and currently with his patients, he realised that there was certainly a very strong finding. And so they did a massive amount of research. They surveyed 17,000 people. Once they had the score, the survey finalised, and what they found was that out of the 17,000 plus people, again, of course, it was middle-class America, so of course there's cultural differences, but that only 1/3 had reported no adverse childhood experience. 2/3 had experienced one or more, and up to 1 to 6 was the more common experience of adverse childhood events. Now, what sadly the research has found is that the higher the ACE score, the stronger the correlation in learning and behavioural problems, higher workplace absenteeism, financial problems, lower lifetime income, chronic depression, suicide attempts, self-harm, eating disorders. All of those really, really awful things have been shown to have a high correlation with the higher your adverse childhood experience score. Now, again, if we're going back to looking at what makes us us, the biopsychosocial model, what happens to us in a traumatic event, all of these things, just it makes so much sense as to why people might struggle with all of these things in their adult life from something that happened when they were younger. Again, another quote from Bessel, because he is the GOAT. As the ACE study has shown, child abuse and neglect is the single most preventable cause of mental illness, the single most common cause of drug and alcohol abuse, and a significant contributor to leading causes of death, such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, and suicide. Again, it's something just to whet your appetite and to be curious as to perhaps why someone might be performing the way they are, maybe leading or just working the way they are, is again because of a traumatic event that happened way in the past. So attachment theory. So this refers to the strong emotional bond and enduring emotional bond that develops between an infant and a caregiver during the infant's first year of life. Now stay with me here. If you're not familiar with the attachment theory, you're going to go, what has this got to do with leadership? But stay with me. So the 4 different types of attachment. So secure attachment. You've got infant, sorry, I'll go back a step. The way that this was posited, so Mary Ainsworth extended what was John Bowlby's attachment theory and did a study called the stranger situation. And what happens is you've got a stranger, a friendly stranger in a room with some toys, see double-sided mirror, caregiver, so for the purpose of explaining mum and child about infant, maybe 1 to 2, will come into the room, chat with the stranger for a quick moment, and then the mother needs to leave the room just for a couple of minutes. Now, it's not so much the departure of the caregiver, it's actually the return that was probably the more important part of the study, and to understand the different types. So when the infant is, secure attachment, which is most of us, 60% of us have a secure attachment to our primary caregiver. The infant is upset on departure but greets return with joy and uses caregiver as a secure base and solid source of support. The insecure avoidant, the attachment, infant reacts to departure with indifference and so it shows little reaction on return. The anxious attachment, infant reacts with panic, then a mix of emotions on return, simultaneously reaching for caregiver but squirming to get away once picked up. And disorganised, that was added later on in the study. It wasn't in the initial study, but infant reacts to departure and return with an inconsistent and confused set of responses. It often does, sadly, correlate with abuse and neglect in the home. So John Bowlby in 1982 suggested that people are naturally driven to seek connection with others, especially during times of stress or uncertainty. When those needs are met with support and responsiveness, it builds a strong sense of security. These early patterns form what's known as our attachment style and how we relate to others, and this tends to stay consistent over time. As leaders, our attachment style can deeply influence how we build trust, manage conflict, give feedback, and create psychological safety within our teams. Understanding this can help us lead with greater empathy, awareness, and effectiveness. Attachment styles show significant predictive power above and beyond personality research, in particular, anxious attachment and neuroticism, with neuroticism definition being a personality trait often defined as a tendency towards anxiety, depression, self-doubt, and other negative emotions and feelings, all of which exist on a spectrum. So personality traits and theories have dominated research in the workplace, and attachment theory has long been overlooked and dismissed as important in the workplace. But beyond one's own parents, other individuals can assume these roles, such as close friends, coaches, romantic partners, work, wife, husband, etc. The functions of attachment figures can be split into several individuals. And it is natural for us to look to leaders as potential attachment figures. We look to leaders to keep us safe and can thus explain some of the interpersonal dynamics of leaders and colleagues in the workplace. So if we're looking here, what the research shows about attachment theory in the workplace is that those with secure attachment are more likely to emerge as leaders. They're better at delegating. They can regulate emotions better, report a higher satisfaction with the workplace, and are less likely to be absent. And they are also less likely to report stressful situations as a threat. They will have a growth mindset. Insecure, anxious, anxiety over rejection, feel unappreciated and misunderstood in the workplace, report a lower level of job satisfaction, and their coping style will be less likely to use emotion-based coping strategies when faced with stressful situations. So emotion-based coping strategies are things that are meant to, that are proven to help with anxiety or stress, like go for a walk, or do some journaling, go and talk to someone, meditate. It will be about these almost task-orientated coping strategies. And then you've got insecure avoidant attachment, a tendency towards using task-oriented leadership, reported the least amount of delegation. So definitely that avoidant has carried through to the workplace. If a supervisor is dismissive or distant, they will more likely experience anger or distress emotions. They'll be less satisfied with their job and their relationships, and their coping style will be less supportive and seek to distance themselves from others. So just another food for thought thing, that actually creating that secure and safe attachment is, in my experience as well, a higher priority with the team than probably a lot of the other things we're all taught when we maybe do a business degree or that sort of stuff. Now, remember, as I said before, this is not yours to fix. You're not trying to fix someone's attachment style. You're trying to heal it. You're just trying to be that secure attachment type relationship. I'll leave it at that. I could talk further, but I'll leave it at that. So again, what has this all got to do with the workplace and leadership? So remember, social connection is what builds resilience, and resilience helps create post-traumatic wisdom, and that wisdom leads to hope. Hope for you and hope for others witnessing and participating in your healing, hope for your community. Again, another really important book to read. What Happened to You? I Should Have Shares in a Book Company. Body Keeps the Score, and What Happened to You. 2 books you must read as a leader. Okay, so we're almost at the end. So I'm sure you've all heard of being seen, heard, and acknowledged is being really important. But do you know why it is so important to be seen, heard, and acknowledged? So what it actually does is it lights up our limbic system. Our limbic system is essentially all of the parts that add up to our emotions. The hypothalamus, the basal ganglia, they all have different roles to play, but all are quite intertwined in essentially being the emotional part of our brain. So feeling listened to and understood changes our physiology. Being able to articulate a complex feeling and having our feelings recognized lights up our limbic brain and creates an aha moment. In contrast, being met by silence and incomprehension kills the spirit. And I sadly know that deeply in my experience now of having lost our son, and certain comments, certain things that have been said to me, both in the workplace, walking down the street, from medical professionals, has all left a marked impact on me when I haven't been seen, and my experience has not been heard or acknowledged. And all it needs is often, I'm so sorry. All it needs, if someone comes to you with a problem or you've identified, don't be scared to have those conversations. We could do a whole other talk, a whole day about how to have these conversations, is that most of the time, and again, in my experience, 95% of the time, all people want is to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. They know you can't fix it. They know you're not going to have the answers. But as leaders, if we can acknowledge, that actually goes towards that creating that secure attachment and creating that trauma-informed environment. So to finish, what does trauma-informed actually mean? It means not inflicting more pain is the point of being informed. Basically, not making someone's day more shit than it needs to be. A very basic example that I'll give in the medical world. So for me, we did go on, as you saw in that photo at the start, we did go on to have another baby. Rani, she's just turned 2. And that pregnancy after loss for me was like, my PTSD symptoms were off the chart extreme. And when I needed to have extra blood tests through the pregnancy, and I was really stunned and disappointed as to the medical world is not very trauma informed, sadly. And I think in the pregnancy and baby loss world, I was surprised that this was not taken into account. So of course, to go and have the bloods, the very friendly people would make conversation with me and say, is this your first? And I would, that question would sometimes send me into a panic attack, because I wouldn't want to honestly answer, because often what is met with was like almost like pity, or like, oh, I'm so sorry, or they would get upset and then I would need to hold their emotion, and it would just be uncomfortable. I got more practice at it and I can do it comfortably now. But when the person taking my blood in the medical world would say, is this your first? I'd say no. And they'd say, oh, how old are they? I say, how many? I'd say, this is my third. How old are they? And I'd have to say 5 or 6, or however old our eldest was at the time. And the other, he's no longer here. And again, like, the response would ruin my day. I would be so upset for the rest of the day for a range of reasons. But what would be a trauma-informed example of that question would be, is this your first pregnancy? That is a safer way to acknowledge all women's miscarriages, losses, ectopic, everything. It actually encapsulates everything. And that I remember being asked that once, and I was like, oh, that's how the question should be asked, because I instantly did not start to panic about how I was meant to respond. So of course you can't be across everything, but the thing about being trauma informed is aiming to just educate and inform yourself. And so being trauma informed, we've already discussed how we've seen what insecure attachment or anxious attachment styles would be like, and how that interacts with the workplace. How trauma can manifest in the workplace is, and I'm sure you've all seen it, is higher staff turnover, higher absenteeism, higher presenteeism. So that's about being present and overworking, but actually not getting anything done. There's people that work 60, 70 hours, but you're kind of like, oh, what are they doing? Because it doesn't feel like they're achieving anything. Lower productivity, increased errors, impaired executive functioning, lower quality of work, increased counterproductive workplace practices, and they will often be that person that will deteriorate the team culture. So what do you do, and how do you build a trauma-informed workplace? There's a really great resource. It's an American resource, but it would work for anywhere. The Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. Sorry, the slides cut it off there. And so remember that this is not a box tick thing. And that's what I'm finding, sadly, often in the really big corporate world, is that this is just a box tick. They do some amazing policies and procedures, but it's just a box tick. It's a piece of paper that sits in a drawer. And when something comes out, something pops up with an employee, they kind of go through it mechanically and methodically. And that's not what being trauma-informed is about. So I'm not going to go through all of those. I'm not just going to read them out. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of perhaps what it might actually tangibly look like. So leading with empathy, as an example, means recognizing strengths, actively listening, and learning from each other. So you may know of that type of manager that goes, oh, you know, they're privy of perhaps their trauma. They're privy of the situation that they've been in before, and they look at it as a negative. Oh, like, no, don't give them that task. They're not going to be able to handle that. They're going to be, they deem them, or they see them as weak. We need to ensure we're always looking from a strengths-based approach. What can that person bring to the table? Not about what they can't. Anchor culture in shared values. So do you know what your values are in your organization? Do you have a vision statement, a mission statement, an objective? And when you do have that, do you refresh it? Do you revise it? And then do you hire based on those values? That actually goes towards being trauma-informed, because you will have like-minded and aligned values within your workplace if you're hiring people based on values rather than just skill set. And I'm sure we can all think of an example of someone that has been hired based on skill set, but they didn't fit the culture and they didn't fit the team. And then the impact that had on everyone was probably very negative. Consider dedicated support. So you don't have to have all the answers in your workplace. That's impossible. You don't even know where, off the top of your head, where to send someone. But we have this wonderful tool in front of us. We're all sitting in front of it. You could type in support for XYZ and something will come up. When someone is really unwell, when they're mentally unwell, when they're under stress, when they've experienced trauma, maybe they're experiencing PTSD symptoms, their ability to make logical decisions, to have the effort, make the effort to do some research to find the answer, could be completely gone out the window. I know for me, immediately after my grief and loss, I'd forgotten everything. I'd forgotten all the things I knew and learned. I needed other people to simply write a list for me to go, right, when you're feeling really overwhelmed, what can you do? Go for a walk, listen to your favorite music, read a book, pat your dog, like really, really basic things. When someone's really unwell, and we could liken it to a physical illness, if someone's really unwell, they need other people to look after them and guide them. So do you know where to send someone for maybe baby loss or miscarriage information, for stories, for support, for free counselling? There are so many free counselling options out there. Quick Google. All the things will come up. Bears of Hope, heartfelt. There's so many Australian-based and possibly something right on our back door that you're just not aware of. So trying to suggest some specific things for people if they ask for help and if they ask for advice. Don't be scared to go, look, I'm not sure, but let's have a look together. Improving that physical and psychological safety. So safe, tension and conflicts are minimized. People will feel safe and secure. There should be strong accountability, clear avenues and explicit protocols to prevent and address challenges. And I think that's a really important part, is the prevention part, is being proactive in this space, is to think about how you can create physical safety, psychological safety. For example, at the moment, we've just been having some issues with just some dodgy people hanging around us, stolen cars, stolen bikes, some altercations and things. And so we have re-looked and re-enhanced how we leave the building at night in pairs, or in moving cars to be in more light rather than the dark, down in the dark part of the car park. Now that all these little things that you don't think are direct are indirectly helping you to become a trauma-informed workplace. So psychological safety, again, it's about building trust, authenticity, good communication, open communication, and one that is genuine, and that you genuinely want to hear someone out, help them, and support them. And model the model. I've always been a big believer that the fish rots from the head down. You have to have your top tier and then some to be aware of trauma, aware of the prevalence, aware of some of these concepts, aware of the impact, and that to be genuinely committed to creating and maintaining a trauma-informed workplace. So before I close, we'll just keep, a couple more slides. It's not all doom and gloom. All those things I told you about the brain, all the things that are impacted and damaged, we have this incredible thing at the top of our head that is plastic. It's neuroplasticity, and that means that we can find different ways of firing different neurons, different connections. That mean it's not all doom and gloom. And what can happen from trauma is that some people can go on to have a greater appreciation of life, improved relationships, new possibilities, personal strength, and spiritual change. One of the most important things that we can learn is self-awareness, but self-regulate, self-regulate, self-regulate. You have to know what works for you to begin before you can even help anyone else. Remembering as well about the pillars of our own mental health and what that involves: sleep, sunlight, getting sunlight, getting the right amount of darkness, movement, nutrition, connection, and stress control. We have to proactively, and this is my concept of, like the old food pyramid that we were now realizing we were just sold to from cereal companies to eat more cereal. We now understand that a balanced diet is a range of things. And yes, professional therapy is so important, highly recommend. But remember, it's only maybe 1 hour of someone's entire month. Maybe they're only going once every 6 weeks or once bi-monthly. That's only 1 hour. There are so many other hours in the day, in the week, that we need to proactively be doing all these different things. And that is unique to you. It's what works for you. Meditation doesn't work for me. I much prefer journaling. My husband, James, not a fan of journaling. There's all sorts of different examples, but you've got to find what works for you. But it doesn't just happen by accident. It's about being proactive and about making the effort and making the time. We all have the same time in the day. There was a good meme that said, we all have the same time in the day as Beyonce, and we do. So what do you prioritize with your time? Really important. Like the car analogy. We all know we can't drive on empty. You've got to keep the tires pumped. If you want to sell the car one day, you've got to get it serviced. But when it comes to our physical and mental health, we often just let it all go until we're done, until we are empty. Be curious, as I've said, because there are a lot of reasons for why people behave the way they do. Now, before we close, I want to take a moment to speak directly to anyone who might be feeling a bit heavy right now, because a lot of the things I talked about were pretty heavy. And if anything I've talked about today has stirred something up in you, memories, emotions, regret, guilt, I want you to know that you're not alone and that it's okay to feel that way. These topics can hit close to home, and it's completely human to have a response. Sometimes when we learn something that new, especially about trauma or relationships, we might look back on our own lives and think, I should have known better, or why didn't I do something differently? But I want to gently remind you, we can only respond with the tools and awareness that we had at the time. You did the best you could with what you knew. So instead of judgment, I invite you to meet yourself with compassion, with kindness, just like you would with a close friend. Healing doesn't come from shame. It comes from self-love, patience, and curiosity. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, take some time to breathe, to ground, and to reach out if you need to. You don't have to process everything all at once. So thank you very much. As I said, please feel free to reach out if you feel you need. And I'm happy to take any questions because we've just got a few minutes.
Yes, and thank you so much, Bianca. That was such a great, insightful presentation. We are open to questions. Please feel free to type that in the chat box. I think we've had a comment come through. It says, not a question, just wanted to say thank you very much. The session has been really insightful and impactful.
Thank you. And yes, very happy to share the balanced diet slide. I'll send it to you, Sonia, to send out, or
yes, we can send that from our end, Bianca. Perfect. Great. Thank you. It says, hi, Bianca, you speak with such passion, which I found really engaging. Thank you. Effective leaders must recognize when active listening should transition into escalation, definitely, delegation or referral to ensure appropriate resolution and support.
Thank you.
That is lovely. I did have a question of my own, Bianca, and if I may, and it was when you mentioned about model the model in the fish rolling from top. I was just wondering if you could maybe share some light on how trauma can show up in organizational systems and not just in individuals, and like how might that look to like the workers working within or even outside of it?
I think it'll be in those really high, you feel a heightened stress across the board, and probably a lot of injustice. Like if they raise something, they'll be reprimanded, or if they don't raise something, they'll be reprimanded. So that organisational justice piece, I think you can quite easily see. There's a lot of trauma almost within the systems and within the business that needs to be unpicked and unpacked, which leads to, I can see that question, how would you deal with a bully at the top? I mean, it's so difficult. I almost think of it, I would want to tackle it if I could in a really, I don't mean this in like a gaslighty way, but kind of if you've ever watched the movie Inception, it's trying to get the thought in their head and have them think that they had the thought on their own. So it's trying to infiltrate it from multiple areas and getting them to perhaps resonate with someone else's story, I find, is when they have the epiphany, particularly, and I'm sorry to stereotype, but particularly for older males in authoritative positions. It can often be that they need to hear someone else's example that's maybe that earned more, or in a similar position, or they're higher up, or they're more famous, or all those sorts of things. And when they hear someone else's story, they go, oh, like it needs to brew away in them, because unfortunately, I think from lower down or from certain angles, information coming in, it just washes off like a duck's back. So I recognize it's really, really tricky. And hopefully there's other mechanisms and mentors perhaps that can perhaps wrap around that person that is perhaps part of the problem or is the problem, that might be able to infiltrate in an indirect, subtle way, but in a way that they might finally realize it themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think there might be a follow-up question that's just come through in relation to that. Is that I'd like to know how to change the mindset if the trauma has been yours in the workplace and you change to a new workplace. What if you don't want to disclose the trauma but have been traumatized by your own boss, the older middle-aged boss?
Can you leave? Can you move workplaces? I think that would be, is there someone else in the organisation that you can talk to? And you don't need to disclose the details for sure. Like you can just say that this has been, you've had an experience in the past. You don't need to disclose it all. But I would say that if the workplace and other people in the workplace aren't willing to raise it with the older middle-aged white boss, it's an organisation you don't want to be part of, because if they're not willing to change and not willing to see that that's not how workplaces should ever have been, but definitely are not today, it's time to find a better organisation.
Thank you, Bianca. I think this might be a last one here. It says, do you have any tips about how to learn about staff attachment theories, lived experiences in an appropriate way for a professional setting that is not being intrusive? Really good question. Yeah.
I love staff building events, like social events where it's not just based around booze, and you've got try to find a reason, maybe it's tacked on to some formal training, and then you can have a more social event. And what we've done in the past is playing the 2 truths and a lie, or those icebreaker games where it actually starts to break down some of the barriers and you learn something new about someone. And it can be in a little bit of a light-hearted way. And then that, though, can allow perhaps more conversations around that. And it might not be directly with you, it might be with another colleague. And then that person has just felt more seen and heard just by someone on the same level or even below them, or, whatever it could be. Just that conversation might be enough to just shift the whole attachment with the whole workplace, if that makes sense. So I think those informal but making them a formal part of an activity can, in my experience, has been a very helpful team building tool.
100%. Bianca, thank you so much. I think this might just bring us to the end. Thank you again for just highlighting all the importance of trauma-informed approaches. I think that really helps ensure that leaders respond with, awareness, compassion, and just care to build a psychosocially safe workplace where people can actually really thrive. Thank you again.
Thank you all. Thanks everyone for attending.
I might just add one quick thing. As some of you might know, this is an event run as part of the WorkSafe Tasmania month. So please head to worksafe.tas.gov.au/month to see what else we have in store. There will also be a survey link towards the end of the session, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you so much again for attending today's session. Have a lovely, great rest of the day and stay safe.